Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Friday, the 5th of May, 1 year and 70 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by our Associate Editor for Defence, Dominic Nichols, Assistant Comment Editor Francis Durnley, Foreign Reporter Genevieve Hall-Allen, and former tank commander and Telegraph writer Hamish de Bretton-Gordon. I started by asking Dom for the latest news from Ukraine.
Well, hi, David. Hi, everybody. So, I guess it is Ukraine, but we're not exactly sure. There's a very, very odd video clip going around social media. You'll find it. It's on our live blog at the moment on our website, so you can have a look there. So this is, it's purporting to be from yesterday, and it shows our old chum Yevgeny Prigozhin, head of the Wagner mercenary group. He is standing in front of what he claims are the bodies, dozens of bodies of Wagner fighters, and he is directly blaming the Russian authorities for their deaths and linking it to a lack of ammunition. Now, I mean, he's done this before. He's spoken out before, but this is quite extreme. And there was another video yesterday when he was not that graphic. He was in front of a load of his fighters and he was addressing the camera in a bit of a rant against the Kremlin. But I mean, he was specifically saying that the Wagner group lacks, and he puts a figure on it. He says 70% of the ammunition they need. And he appealed directly to Defence Minister Sergei Shoigu and Valery Gerasimov, the chief of the General Staff, the head of the whole Russian armed forces. Well, head of the whole Russian armed forces, and when he's got spare time, apparently he's running the war in Ukraine. But in this video, it's very graphic. The two of them together. So, like I say, the one from the one that was released yesterday and one today. There's nothing to suggest they weren't filmed recently, but we don't know when they were filmed. But it's quite graphic, the one when he's in front of the dead bodies, and there's a lot of potty mouth, so beware of that. But he put it on Telegram, and I mean it's quite extraordinary what he was saying. I'm going to use the old Hollywood trick of replacing the naughty word with the word melon farmers. Apparently Hollywood used to do that because your mouth makes the same shape if you say melon farmers as the actual naughty word. But anyway, I digress. So Prigozhin was saying, these are the guys from Wagner PMC who died today. Their blood is still fresh. We're 70% short of ammo. Shoigu, Gerasimov, where's the melon farming ammunition? Melon farmers, look at them. And then he went on. He kept going on. He was very angry. Now listen to me, you melon farming bar stewards. These are someone's melon farming fathers and someone's sons. And those bar stewards who are not giving us any melon farming ammunition will be in hell munching on their melon farming insides. It's absolutely extraordinary. We know that there have been tensions. The relationship between Prigozhin and sort of Moscow centre, if you like, goes in fits and starts. 1 minute he's in favour, the next he's not. He's allied himself with Surovikin, the general who was previously in charge of the war and is now just in charge of, I don't know, some bit of it. But there's politics here, which I'll talk about in a moment. But he finishes off. He says, if you give us the normal amount of ammunition, there will be 5 times fewer of them, as in pointing to the dead bodies. And says, they came here as volunteers. They are dying so that you can gamble in your redwood cabinets. It's just extraordinary. And then the video from yesterday, he talks about he talks about the soft bureaucrats in the Kremlin. They're all turning to jelly and. I mean, right, he's pinned his colours to the mast, right? So there's long-standing tensions here, as we know, but this is on the back of... So against that background, but last weekend he threatened to withdraw Wagner troops from Bakhmut if Moscow didn't provide him more ammunition. And he's reiterated that position, and he's actually put a date on it. He said that they will leave Bakhmut on May the 10th if they don't get more, in particular, artillery ammunition. And he said May the 10th because he doesn't want to embarrass Russia by leaving before the Victory Day parade on the 9th, which is, hang on, can I take my shoes off here? Next Tuesday. See you next Tuesday, Prigozhin. Anyway, he went on, I declare on behalf of the Wagner fighters, on behalf of the Wagner command, that on May the 10th, 2023, we are obliged to transfer positions in the settlement of Bakhmut to units of the Defence Ministry and withdraw the remains of Wagner to logistics camps to lick our wounds. Now, look, there's probably something going on in translation here, but because lick our wounds sounds quite sort of victim. He's inhabiting that role. I'm withdrawing Wagner PMC units because without ammunition they are doomed to a senseless death. And he then added that they've fallen out of favour with envious near-military bureaucrats. So, blimey, it's a bit of a download. But what's happening here? So I mean, this is all very public stuff. Clearly, it's in the public domain. We are talking about it. He's not sending these messages privately. If he was, I guess he is genuinely concerned about not having enough ammunition, but he's not making these points privately through the correct channels, although I might sound like a near military bureaucrat by talking about process here. But, he's doing this publicly, and there's got to be a reason for that. I mean, it is a very, very big call for him to say this stuff out loud. It's a political move. Yes, of course, it has battlefield impact, but this is a political move. And I just wonder if he's sniffing an opportunity here for some political favour. Of course, we can't ignore the Kremlin drone strike the other night. We're still no idea what's really going on there, but there's a lot of stuff happening in the politics, and I think this is an extraordinary intervention by Prigozhin, and it'll be really interesting to see what the Russian MOD say about it, and we will watch with interest this spat carrying on in the public domain. It's great. Separately, there are reports of a second drone strike on the Ilsky oil refinery in southern Russia. So we now put yourself on the map. We're 100 k's southeast from the Kerch Bridge. Now that's reported to be the second strike in as many days. This is coming from TASS, Russian state media, citing the emergency services, says there was a fire there. However, another Russian news agency, RI Novosti, are saying that the fire today was actually, it was reignited from the attack on Wednesday. So there was an attack on the drone strike attack on this place on Wednesday, and there are questions as to whether or not it was hit again yesterday or if the fire has reignited. There are no reports of casualties, but it continues this pattern, as we mentioned yesterday, of logistic nodes, fuel in particular, around the edges of Ukraine, some inside, but mostly in Russia itself, actually, and the mysterious train crashes. These logistic nodes deciding to suddenly combust. Now, finally, today's UK Defence Intelligence assessment are saying that the recent uptick in incidents on the railway lines in particular has almost certainly caused short-term localised disruption to Russian military rail movements. Now, they're saying on May the 1st, the train was derailed because of an explosive device. We're up in Bryansk now, so this is the region of Russia that borders Ukraine and Belarus, so kind of northeast, couple of 100 k's northeast of Kyiv. Explosive device detonated on the tracks on May the 1st. And then the following day, there were more reports of a second train being derailed in the same region. Now, okay, British MOD is saying it will cause short-term localised disruption. So this is not a game changer. Short-term / localised disruption, not an end game. But it's forming a pattern. And as we said, this is exactly the kind of thing you would want to do ahead of any counteroffensive in order to limit the range of the vehicles. Russian vehicles can only go so far if they haven't got fuel, clearly, and so you are limiting their freedom of movement, and you force the Russian logistic chain to be even more exposed and open to interdiction from Ukraine by deleting some of these fuel depots and the trains and all the rest of it. So really interesting operations going on there. But and there'll be more of those, I'm sure. I'll take a little pause.
Thanks, David. All Dom's talk of bastions makes me want to go to the pub, maybe after the recording. So I want to stay on the military theme first of all, because I was reflecting yesterday that the question of who was responsible for the drone attack in some ways is less significant than the question of how it's going to be utilised by Putin's regime. And we are seeing today that it is being used predictably for maximum effect. So our Russian correspondent Natalia Vasilyeva has written an in-depth analysis on the decision by the Kremlin yesterday after our broadcast to blame the US for orchestrating the attack, which it said was carried out by Ukraine on their behalf. So the Kremlin said that and this was Dmitry Peskov, our old friend, the Kremlin spokesman, he said that attempts to disown this, both in Kyiv and in Washington, are, of course, absolutely ridiculous. We know very well that decisions about such actions, about such terrorist attacks, are made not in Kyiv, but in Washington. So playing up this line that this is a war against NATO and that it's being orchestrated by Washington rather than this being a war against Ukraine itself, because, of course, that would be far too humiliating given the defeats that they have suffered there. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has also said this morning that the drone attack wouldn't have taken place without the knowledge of Washington, and has warned that Moscow would respond with concrete actions. He's currently in India, and he said that without the knowledge of their minders, the terrorists from Kyiv would not have been able to perform this attack. So again, reiterating the same line. Again, predictably, On late-night talk shows, on state television, pro-Kremlin commentators have been calling for blood. One hawkish member of the Russian parliament has said that Ukrainian leaders should no longer be on the face of the earth. Nothing stops us from doing it. All what we would expect, although I do think it is interesting as well that Russian state television has not shown footage of the drone strike itself. So that's something that, of course, has been all across Western media, including ourselves. But Pravda, Russia's best-selling tabloid, has covered the attack as a front-page story, but has tried to really downplay its significance and the threat that it posed, and has refused to show the footage. They've said there are no victims or material damage on the Kremlin. And so this and the slow reaction from the Kremlin, I think it took them about 12 hours to pick up or start to cover the news extensively after the attack, plus the authorities meddling with GPS signals in Moscow in an attempt to possibly prevent drone attacks, is leading some analysts to argue that it's actually unlikely that this was a Russian false flag operation as a result. Others disagree, of course, and we've touched on that yesterday, and I'm sure we'll talk about it again later on. We will, of course, continue to monitor this story very closely. But staying on Russia, I also want to discuss a story by Natalia about Russian society, and this is an interesting one as well. So Russia's parliament is expected to crack down on gender reassignment in an apparent attempt to discourage young men from registering as women to avoid the draft. So despite a little bit of context here, I think is important. So despite the Kremlin's very aggressive stance against LGBT and transgender people, Russia still has a fairly liberal legislation that allows change of gender markers following a psychiatric examination and doesn't require sex reassignment surgery. So this clampdown, though, that's being talked about is partly, we know, due to the sort of quite profoundly conservative shift in the society used by the war. So we've got one justice minister saying that it's now time to enshrine family values in Russian law, and ruling out the possibility of somebody changing their gender purely by changing documents. But also, we've got a member of parliament saying things that this is actually a direct consequence of the war. Many young people have approached private clinics to sign off on change of gender to avoid the draft because of the special military operation in Ukraine. And that, I think, is the main driver here if this bill is adopted, and there's possibility it'll be adopted as early as May 15th. If it does happen, it marks another cultural shift happening as a consequence of the war. But I think the anxiety around this is less about the cultural fear of transgender people, but more about, obviously, the impact of this potentially on the draft. And we've already reported, of course, in the past about concerns around the draft. And many, many young people, of course, have fled the country in order to avoid being forced to sign up and fight in Ukraine. The last story I wanted to talk about is around a row that has erupted in the last 48 hours between Ukraine and Germany regarding the first planned visit of President Zelensky next week. So Kyiv is threatening to call off this visit to Berlin after details of the high security operation were leaked to the press. Ukrainian officials are reportedly deeply disappointed by the leak, which they suspect deliberately contained highly sensitive information. A source inside the Ukrainian government told the German website T-Online that it is open to question whether the Ukrainian president will carry out his first visit to Germany since the Russian invasion started. Mr. Zelensky's next movements, as I say, hang in the balance after these leaks, and they are extensive. I mean, they talk about the hotel even that President Zelensky would due to be staying at. So huge concern, understandably, and pretty embarrassing for Germany. I'm sure they will be very keen for this meeting to go ahead and for this visit to go ahead. Another, and this is the final issue that's causing consternation amongst the more pro-Ukrainian commentariat in German society, is around the decision by authorities in Berlin to ban Russian and Ukrainian flags from being flown near the city's memorials this weekend as people commemorate the 77th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. So in a statement, the Berlin police have said that the act of remembering, as well as the respect for memorials and monuments, must be preserved against the backdrop of Russia's current war of aggression in Ukraine. The war must not be allowed to spill over into conflicts or disputes in Berlin beyond the democratic discourse. Some feel that this is a rather poorly timed decision, some even going further and saying it's insulting in the context of the war. They feel that Soviet memorials are themselves not necessarily something to be treated with this reverence, rather monuments to oppressors, even if the Soviets were fighting against the Nazis. I saw one tweet that was saying those same soldiers raped 100,000 women during the Battle of Berlin. And of course, it's been very interesting registering the reassessment of such monuments as a consequence of this war. You'll remember many months ago the extensive examples in Poland of Soviet monuments being removed, and I believe that's happened again this week, in fact. This is a hugely contentious issue, and one that's likely, I think, your opinion on it is likely to be formed by your perception of these monuments and your perceptions toward these particular countries. For those in Germany who believe that the country hasn't gone far enough in its support of Ukraine, they're looking at this decision as an example of further weakness and capitulation to Russian narratives on the issues. For others, it's unrelated, and the Soviet monuments should be treated with a respect given the soldiers that were killed as a consequence of fighting Nazism. So whichever view one stands on, I think it's one that you have to hear the other side of the argument. But politics is all about perception, as I've said many times, and the timing of this, given the Zelensky visit, is unfortunate if the German government is seeking to drive home its support for the Ukrainian cause. But more on that, David, as we have it.
Genevieve Hall-Allen, thank you so much for joining us from the Foreign Desk. I know we've only got you for a short period of time, so what's been coming up at the top of the Ukraine live blog for you? What stories have you been looking into today?
Hi, thanks, David. Yeah, just a few stories from the live blog today. I suppose we should start really with some pretty concerning news to come out of the Zaporizhzhia region concerning the nuclear power plant. A Russian official has told state news agency TASS that record high water levels on the Dnipro River threaten to overwhelm a major dam in southern Ukraine and damage part of that power plant. Renat Karcha, an advisor to the general director of nuclear energy firm Rosenergoatom, said that if the Nova Kakhovka dam did indeed rupture, the power cable line for the plant's pumping stations would be flooded. Russia's control of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant in Energodar has been an issue of international concern since Russian forces seized the area pretty early on in the war last year. The surrounding areas have seen heavy shelling since early on in the war. And last November, following the withdrawal of Russian troops from Kherson, nearby Kherson, satellite images showed significant new damage to the hydroelectric dam. So this advisor, Renat Karcha, told TASS, and this is in quotes, this would create functional problems for the operation of the plant and risks for nuclear safety. That is, if the dam does become overwhelmed. A Russian-backed official in the region, Vladimir Rogov, told REA Novosti that the high water levels could also flood nearby settlements. However, he did say the rainy season has passed, so there is hope that the water level in the reservoir will be able to stabilise. Interestingly, these comments are a significant contrast to what Ukrainian officials were saying back in March, when they feared that the nuclear facility could face a shortage of water to cool reactors by late summer, as Russian forces had let water out of a reservoir that supplied the plant. So ongoing tensions and ongoing kind of nervousness surrounding that power plant in such a crucial region in the war. Elsewhere, outside of Ukraine now, but concerning Ukrainians and Russian representatives actually at a meeting of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Black Sea Economic Community. So this is taking place in Ankara in Turkey. And there was an incident on Thursday where a physical fight broke out between Russian and Ukrainian representatives. I mean, there's pretty remarkable footage of this incident, which you can actually see on our website. And it shows Russian delegation secretary Valery Davitsky marching up to his Ukrainian counterpart, Alexander Marikovsky, who was waving a Ukrainian flag. According to reports, Mr. Marikovsky was hoping to photobomb a video interview with Russia's lead delegate while holding the flag. But Mr. Stavitsky, the Russian representative, snatches this flag out of the hands of the Ukrainian representative and walks off. At which point the Ukrainian representative chases after him and punches him. And the physical altercation begins. People have to intervene. You can hear somebody out of shot, shouting, "It's our flag." So that's pretty remarkable stuff to see on a kind of global stage, and just shows that tensions are not really being kept under wraps there. Elsewhere at the same event, the Ukrainian delegation stormed into a meeting and unfurled the Ukrainian yellow and blue flag when a Russian delegate was speaking. And at another event, a Russian State Duma member, Ola Timofeyeva, addressed delegates while wearing a St. George's ribbon, which is seen by Ukrainians as a symbol of Russian aggression. So this caused major consternation among the Ukrainian delegation, who ended up actually being ejected from the meeting when security staff trying to calm down the situation were pushed out of the way.
Thanks, Genevieve. Could I just ask you to talk about one more story? Of course, tomorrow in the UK is the coronation of Charles III. There will be Ukrainian representation at the coronation. Who's going?
Yes, so this is the news that Olena Zelenska, the First Lady of Ukraine, is to attend the coronation on Saturday. This was confirmed late last night by the official website of the President of Ukraine, and actually Ms. Zelenska was pictured standing on the steps of number 10 Downing Street yesterday with Akshata Murty, the wife of Rishi Sunak. She also met with the Prime Minister himself yesterday. According to this press release, Ms. Zelenska thanked the UK for its support of Ukraine, and actually in particular for organising the Eurovision Song Contest, which is another major event in the calendar alongside obviously the coronation. And she said the inability of the winning country to host this competition should be another reminder to the world of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. But yes, this is confirmation that Olena Zelenska will be among the many representatives of foreign nations at the coronation on Saturday. And just to note that we are going to be covering the coronation live here at The Telegraph on our website and YouTube channel tomorrow. Dom will be joined by Camilla Tominey and Gordon Rayner for that, so make sure to check it out tomorrow.
Thanks very much for that, Genevieve. Thanks for joining us today. Hamish, de Bretton Gordon, thank you for joining us. It's really good to have you back on. There's an awful lot to talk about. I'd be interested in your thoughts on the story that Genevieve brought us about the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant and the threat of flooding there. What is your take on that?
Yeah, hi, good afternoon. And great to be back on the pod. Very, very worrying, I think. Just before we go on to the high water mark point, I'm sure it was covered in the Telegraph, I think earlier on this week, maybe Tuesday or Wednesday, that the International Atomic Energy Agency said that their people on the ground confirmed that the Russians had wired explosives to several areas of Zaporizhzhia. So we've always suspected that, but that was confirmed by the IAEA. So that sort of builds up the tempo. It's, is this part of some shaping operation? The Russians are telling us that a massive dam is potentially going to burst and overflow, which could have an impact on Zaporizhzhia, could affect the cooling mechanism, could affect the power, which, as we've discussed before, without cooling and power, we could go critical in the reactors and also the spent fuel outside the reactors. And at a time when, I expect we'll talk in a minute about counteroffensives, the impact of an accident at Zaporizhzhia could have a profoundly negative effect on Ukraine manoeuvre to this counteroffensive. So again, it seems super cynical, and I'm sure I discussed a similar situation I had with the Peshmerga, the Iraqi Kurd military, when I was advising them in the fight with ISIS, when ISIS blew up a massive sulfur mine and put a huge contaminated cloud of sulfur dioxide, 400,000 tons, into the air. And that went straight across the advancing Iraqi army and really stalled them and made them have to change their plans. So hopefully this is an entirely natural event that TASS are reporting. But, I take what TASS says in the same sort of vein, that I take the briefings of Chemical Ali back in the first Gulf War, who's sounding, I must say, the Russian spokesman with his talk about the drone explanation is sounding very similar to Chemical Ali. So I think it's something that we really need to watch very carefully. Myself and others have been calling for a UN demilitarized zone around Zaporizhzhia. And if the Russians were really concerned about safety and wanted to do the right thing, then they would help. But they don't, and they won't.
Thanks, Hamish. Well, let's go on to talk a little bit about this potential counteroffensive. You've been seeing all the same news that we have, these train derailments, oil depots in Ukraine, in occupied Crimea, and in Russia going up in smoke. What do you make of it? What are your thoughts?
Well, interesting. Dom yesterday talked about shaping ops, and shaping ops is how you prepare the battlefield, so it's advantageous to you. And Mike Martin has written quite a detailed piece in the paper today, which I'll come back to. But just on the shaping of, just a quick burst on the drone thing, because I think this could be part of it. And I had some very interesting discussions yesterday around the bazaars, and just a couple of points on the drone thing. If it was a US drone, we would see a fin in TASS and in Pravda with the stars and stripes on it. If it was a US drone, that dome that's got a bit of scorch mark on it would no longer exist. So, and also we'd expect the US AMBO to go and pull his tabs in at the Kremlin, and obviously that hasn't happened. On the false flag piece, again, somebody who really knows how the Russians operate, and Putin was telling me that this is really contrary to the way he operates. He's a winner. He's a strong man. So for a drone to get through and do this, is inconceivable. It's so well protected. And I know that you covered that. The third element, and we mentioned Prigozhin at the beginning here and what he's up to. Well, it's been suggested to me that the third and most likely option is either separatists or perhaps disgruntled Wagner people. And there are a lot of them. And Prigozhin, is very, very disgruntled. I understand from a drone expert that it looks like, probably this thing was launched fairly close to where it went. Might have had some electronic countermeasures that allowed it to get through the umbrella, as it were, to create what it's created. So, again, this could be part of the shaping operations. But I think, the shaping operations you covered, and that will happen. We appear to be getting to the right. All the moons are starting to align now. The weather, training equipment, again, things are happening with the Russians. I think what has struck me is that we know virtually nothing about what Ukraine is up to, this force that they have established, which again I think is a really good thing. And going on to the offensive itself, Mike Martin discussed a whole host of options here. Which one they'll take, I don't know, but I expect the plan would be, and you look at the maps that he's produced in the Telegraph today, it's all about dislocation, getting behind the enemy, sealing them off, because we really don't think they've got the ability to do manoeuvre warfare and manoeuvre around this. We don't think the Russian Air Force, again, I think we discussed a few weeks ago, I had very interesting chats with people who know about these things. You don't have the ability to do sort of combined arms operation in any mass. So very, very interesting. And I think, and next week, the 9th of May is pretty key for the Russians, might be pretty key for the Ukrainians as well.
Thanks very much, Hamish. Well, we'll come back to some of that, I'm sure. Dom, can I ask for your thoughts on some of Hamish's points? But also maybe Hamish mentioned there the expression pull his tabs in. Could you just tell us what that means, Dom?
Yeah, I think I know what Hamish means, having been on the receiving end of this on a number of occasions, all for crimes for which I was not responsible. I think what he means is when he says pull his tabs in, I think he means the ambassador, he was suggesting US ambassador would be called into the Russian foreign ministry for a dressing down, for a one-way conversation, an interview without coffee, as we used to call it in the military. So basically put his tabs in, put his heels together, all that kind of stuff, and stand by with the yellow pages stuffed down the back of your trousers for a bit of a spanking. As I say, it may have happened to me in the past, but I was cleared of all crimes.
Thanks, Dom. Could we talk a little bit more then, Hamish and Dom, about the Russian Air Force? We've had quite a few questions from listeners on this about their effectiveness, how they might be able to respond to any potential Ukrainian counteroffensive. What do both of you make of that?
Well, if I jump in first, let Hamish have the more considered view. I mean, yes, this is one of the ongoing anomalies with this war. Where is the Russian Air Force? Why have they not turned up? They have been extremely reluctant to go forward with their own lines, i.e. to move forward with the protective umbrella that's given to them by any ground-based air defence assets, when actually, of course, it works both ways. The air should be providing support to the ground as the ground supports the air, and maritime does its own thing. But they should each be providing an umbrella for the other, and then moving forward accordingly. But the Russian Air Force have not really been doing that. They've been staying over their own areas, either inside Russia. The big Tupolev strategic bombers are launching their cruise missiles in Russian airspace. They're not going anywhere near Ukrainian airspace. Russian Air Force assets, the vast majority of them are not going ahead of their forces in the areas in Ukraine they're currently operating in. all of which means that you're just not going to get anywhere fast. Now, the one caveat I'll say is that we've been talking recently, or I've made the point that the Russian missile strikes across the country, I think, and I still stick by this, but I think it is an inefficient use of resource. I think if Bakhmut and the Donbass is their priority, they should be using what sparse ammunition they have, these precision guided munitions or drones or whatever they're using. They should be using it in that to support that main effort. They've not been doing that. They've been scattering it around. I have received comments, and these are really good, well evidenced opinions that actually, well, maybe the documented apparent paucity of air defence assets from Ukraine is the reason Russia's doing this, so that they are using up their stocks. I take that on board. That is a very, very, very valid point, and thank you to our great listeners for making that point to me. I just think that would have been valid maybe 6 months ago, but there's been an inflow of air defence assets to Ukraine from external supporters for months now, and I think their stocks are they might not be fantastic, but I don't think they're anything like what they were. You're now seeing, I mean, it's generally most, if not all, missiles and drones aimed at Kyiv are shot down, and the vast majority elsewhere are also shot down. Some get through, of course. We've seen that this week, and civilians are being killed in their dozens. Was it at least 20 in Kherson? Although that was artillery, that was not missiles or drones. But I'm not saying this isn't without cost, but I think the moment has passed really for Russia to be trying to go after Ukrainian air defence assets. And even if they had been, then they'd not been doing it. They'd not been doing it piecemeal. They were doing it piecemeal. If they were using their air and missile forces for that end, they were just firing missiles at them and drones. They weren't using the Air Force. So it all comes back to that original question. And Justin Bronk from RUSI, who we've had on here before, one of the country's premier brains on air power, he wrote a paper months ago saying, "Where's the Russian Air Force?" And there's still no real answer for that beyond, well, they just don't know how to use air power effectively. But Hamish will have a more considered view.
Thanks, Dom. I sort of absolutely agree with everything you said. And as fellow tank soldiers, or put me as a tank soldier, commenting on air power, will certainly be stirring the gin and tonics in the RAF club, no doubt, this afternoon. But I have spoken to a few people about this, and I think there's a massive psychological ops piece going on here. And as we know, the Ukrainians are very canny and very good at this. Somebody told me that a lot of the Ukrainian pilots know the Russian pilots and are quite often speaking to them, over the airways, and telling them that they're going to get shot down. I think the air defence thing is key and part of the PSYOPs too. And everybody knows the Patriots now steaming around in Ukraine, and which is something that the Russian pilots would be concerned about. The bombers firing the cruise missiles from outside Russia, that seems sensible, but actually mixing it dirty at the coalface with dogfighting and ground attack, that just doesn't seem to be happening. Again, it would appear that they can only fight in onesies and twosies, so a couple of aircraft supporting each other, where actually, from what I understand, you need to operate aircraft more like tanks, mutual support, covering each other, and that sort of thing. The other point is that these MiGs, these are not $500,000 tanks, which they've lost $2,500 of. These are $20, $30, $40, $50 million vehicles, air vehicles, and the Russians just can't really afford to use them. Whether they're saving them in case that Ukraine decides to push a bit further than the border, who knows? But I think the psychological piece has sort of kept them on the ground. The build-up of air defence, absolutely key. And these pilots are not the sort of the basic tankies and the basic infantrymen who we know are being thrown into the fight with virtually no training and equipment. These are highly intelligent, highly trained people who are probably making the decision, actually, I want my eggs and bacon tomorrow morning. I don't want to go and fly out over Ukraine and end up in the ground there.
Thanks, Dom and Hamish there. Francis, there's been some interesting news coming through on our live blog. Can you talk us through it?
Yes, David. Well, breaking news. The exiled mayor of the occupied Ukrainian town of Melitopol, or Melitopol, as the Ukrainians call it, has cited reports indicating that Russian occupation authorities in the south might be preparing an evacuation in the face of a possible Ukrainian counteroffensive. Now, as I say, this is breaking, but I understand that Natalia is writing up as we speak. So this exiled mayor, he said on social media that local residents who are reporting to him that the occupation administration in the towns around Melitopol in the Zaporizhia region are setting up the evacuation of local residents further away from the front line and are cutting escalation on the battlefield. And he's also reported general panic in the town and long lines to petrol stations. Those working for the occupation administration are reportedly telling people to stay at home in the case of explosions. And whilst there haven't been yet remarks coming out of the Russian-occupied authorities, I think we can probably expect some kind of rebuttal from this, because this clearly is a significant story and will lead, no doubt, to some alarm that something quite significant is happening there. But as I say, David, it's a breaking story, so something that listeners who are hearing this a little bit later will no doubt want to check out on the Telegraph website.
Thanks very much for that, Francis. Dom and Hamish, any more updates from you? And Francis as well, of course.
Well, I would just say, just as we were talking about air power, there are reports yet to be confirmed, but there are reports breaking at the moment that on May the 4th, be with you, my son, so what was that, yesterday? At 02:40 in the morning, Kyiv time, Kinsal, KH-47M2 Kinsal hypersonic missile has been reported was shot down. So these are air-launched ballistic missiles. And the thing about hypersonics, or this family of vehicles, is that they go so fast and their trajectory is generally so steep that it is extraordinarily difficult to intercept them. However, there are reports that one of them was shot down yesterday very early in the morning. So there's debris that's been found something was shot down, and there's debris in Ukraine. The warhead assembly of that debris matches that's in the Kinsal and other Iskander series of ballistic missiles. Now, if that's true, that's very significant, because we were told that hypersonics are the next amazing weapon that will get through anything. There will always be, some will get through, but there's always a way in military technology of bringing stuff down. But if that's true, it was probably brought down by a US Patriot system. It could have been fired in response to the drone strikes against the Kremlin. It would have been a very big weapon, very big blast if it had landed properly on whatever the target was. So if this is a Kinsal hypersonic missile that's been shot down by a Patriot, that is very, very significant. But like I said, that's breaking now and yet to be totally confirmed.
Thank you, Dom and Francis. Anything further from you, Hamish?
Only to sort of add a tiny bit to that. We've heard a lot about escalation after the drone strike, and that might well be it, because as we've discussed before, I don't think Putin can escalate with his tactical nuclear weapons. And there was some guff on social media yesterday about bombers being armed with tactical nuclear bombs, but I think it had absolutely no credence at all. So that might be it. But I agree with Dom. I mean, this is hugely significant. This hypersonic missile that was going to destroy NATO has been knocked out of the sky by Patriot. Expect to hear a bit more of that, I expect, from the Ukrainians on the western side, if this is the case.
Thank you very much, Hamish, Dom and Francis. Can we move to your final thoughts ahead of the long weekend? I must say, actually, quickly to listeners, unfortunately, it is another UK bank holiday on Monday after the coronation of King Charles III. So we will have a recorded episode, which we've already done, of questions and answers using the questions you send in to our email. Dom, Francis and I have recorded about 40 minutes, I think, for the episode on Monday. So do tune in there. There will be no live episode on Monday. It is another UK bank holiday. So Francis or Dom, would you like to start? What are your final thoughts?